Space. Is it natural? We look around and see trees, ponds, and animals. We look up and we see distant stars, inhospitable worlds. Humans tend to disassociate from nature, and even more so from space. But we owe everything to the materials that make up the universe we do not inhabit. Today, we will examine how we came to be, and perhaps that will add some context to your perspective of the natural world. Take a moment to look around you. Everything you see is composed of the same trace elements that have existed since the beginning of our known universe. From the water you drink to the lead in a pencil dragging across a piece of paper. It is all a rearrangement of the stardust that can be traced back to a single moment, the initial moment of existence as we understand it. Imagine a small fruit, an apple, grapefruit, or clementine. Now, condense the known universe, every person that has ever existed, every planet in every solar system, every galaxy, into a super dense ball the size of that fruit. The energy of all that mass was released through an explosion nearly incomprehensible in size and force. From that moment, the infant stage of existence of the ever-expanding universe came to be. The early universe was a volatile place. Great gaseous monsters at high heats were interacting, exploding, compressing, mere puppets to the compounding forces of gravity. Among these existed a great disk composed mostly of hydrogen and hints of helium. The disk spun rapidly, picking up pace with every rotation. The immense gravity acting on this disk instigated the creation of our sun at its center, where the highest concentration of mass existed. Planets formed as well, including our Earth. It was a molten and savage place, inhospitable to even the most dexterous and hardy creatures that exist today. Carbon dioxide, expounded by volcanic eruptions, filled our atmosphere. This was accented by other poisonous gases that were carried to the planet by a barrage of meteor and asteroid impacts. The ball of molten metal and jagged rock slowly cooled, growing more docile. Our oceans existed then as a mixture of various inorganic compounds that absorbed energy from the asphyxiating atmosphere to generate monomers, simple molecules that would eventually populate specific areas of the primordial soup. Our world was a mixture of various compounds and still barren rocks. These monomers, in a condensed state, were able to combine and generate polymers, simple proteins. This chemical circumstance gave rise to the ancient form of DNA, the birth of the first cell. Millions of years later, these cells had absorbed enough surrounding polymers to generate the very first plants, microscopic organisms capable of releasing oxygen. These were the cells that would eventually generate roses, pineapples, and vines. This is not the strain of cells from which Homo sapiens was derived. Bacteria that were able to harness oxygen developed millions of years later and coagulated to form greater cells that had organelles of sorts to carry out functions. The first complex organism birthed from these evolutionary developments was a polyp, a simple creature that stuck to the ocean's floor. Through evolutionary prowess, these polyps were able to produce offspring with gills more adept for filtering. From these polyps came even more complex offspring that were able to move about their environment before settling down as stagnant, mature adults. If an infantile polyp never developed, had failed to mature properly, it would maintain its larval state and continue to swim freely about the ocean. They developed mechanisms for moving more dexterously, developing somewhat of a backbone. From these creatures came a variety of free-swimming animals, fish, that eventually began to consume each other. The fastest, most equipped beings survived. The slowest died off. Around this time, the Earth itself was also going through changes, heating up, dehydrating the lakes of which these animals were living. Although they had succeeded in developing jaws, fins, and other appendages to use for surviving, they now faced a new challenge, an environmental challenge, and were forced to drag themselves from the water in order to search for a more flourishing environment. Those who were able to do so perpetuated the evolutionary cycle, escaped a near certain death. These land-walking pioneers eventually developed into the world's first amphibians, beings able to live both in and out of water. However, their eggs, which they laid in the water, were easily consumed and they had to adapt even further. Thus, the first reptiles were born, capable of laying thick-shelled eggs on land. There were two branches of early reptiles, one of which that grew into feathered, winged creatures capable of short-distance flight. Others branched off to become dinosaurs, the largest of which would be towering giants, the most infamous being the T-Rex. Others were much smaller. They were tiny, scurrying reptiles that were able to carve a niche into this incredibly aggressive environment. From these tiny little dinosaurs, we get the first marsupial. Following the first marsupial, we get a shrew, or a shrew-like creature that is the earliest of the mammals. By this time, the former bacterial plants had evolved into complex organisms, transforming the previously poisonous atmosphere into an oxygen-rich environment. The developing mammalian species eventually took to the treetops to avoid ground-based predators. While in the trees, they developed incredible coordination and their brains continued to grow. From these large brains, they developed a curiosity about the natural environment. The seed that would grant us the evolutionary advantage against all other animals. The tree-based primates continued to grow, continued to change and evolve. Some of them returned back to the floor. Now, from ape to man exists a large spectrum of genetic offshoots. To cover them all would require hours, the length of the script spanning an entire novel. Here we have roughly 4 minutes. The development will be condensed, generalized but expanded on when necessary. The Homo genus, the genus of which Homo sapiens belong, began with an ape that stood on 2 feet, eventually developing an entire bipedal pattern, allowing their curiosity to expand, freeing up their hands to become instruments of discovery, of investigation. Eventually, they developed stone tools, even furthering their advantage against other creatures. A couple of generations later, in Africa, Homo erectus makes their debut on the global stage. These beings were critical thinkers. They tracked packs of animals for hunting and followed the seasons to ascertain fruits and grains. Despite their ability, their brain was still 70% smaller than that of a modern man. Following this cognitive development is the Homo ergaster, who developed the use of fire for the first time. This branch of the Homo genus began losing its fur and developed dark skin to combat the sun's pressing heat. The Homo genus continued branching off, interbreeding and changing, their large brains allowing for language acquisition and social learning. Eventually they formed packs, began communicating with a common tongue. Civilization's ancestor could be perceived as these groups of nomadic beings. All branches of our ancestors were completely annihilated by Homo sapiens, victims of an evolutionary disadvantage, leaving us, the sole survivors, to continue on. We grew tired of chasing animals and learned that certain crops could be harvested, grown on our own. The animals could also be herded. This leap in mental engineering led to the beginning of what would be the agricultural revolution. Now, with their food all in one place, they were able to start developing homes inside of caves or constructed out of loose materials. Some of them settled, some of them continued to wander. They spread all across the entire globe, and it is from these settled civilizations that modern man eventually developed. We began as a microbe on a disgustingly savage planet, a planet that didn't want to host life, that didn't care if life existed. We must always remember that we come from humble beginnings. We owe the universe, our planet, for everything that we have been able to accomplish. So while we rotate, sitting here on our bright blue speck, we should keep in mind where we come from, how many organisms died in order to grant us the opportunity to thrive.